Hello and welcome to the Complete Physio podcast. We are back and we've got a very exciting episode for you. Today we're going to be concentrating on novice marathon runners. So it might be somebody that's actually just signed up to do their first marathon, which is very exciting, or it could be somebody that's done a few, but is just looking for more top tips that we're going to go through to make sure that you get to the start line. If you've run a marathon before, then we might be going through some of the points that you're aware of, but I'm sure we're going to cover some really important points for you, particularly related to those common errors that we see as physiotherapists. Now, what you've got to remember is that 50% of people will get an injury during marathon training. 20% of people won't even get to the start line. So make sure you listen to the end and hopefully we'll give you lots of useful information. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce a very experienced sports physiotherapist and UK athletics endurance coach, Mr. Alex Quinn.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for
No
having me
problem. Thank you for coming, Alex. Do you want to just give us a bit of an idea about where your interest in running came from and how you spend your working week at the moment?
Yeah, no problem. So my interest in running started as a kid. So I've run since I was 10 years old, so sort of 30 years now. Club runner, reasonable level. Stopped when I went to university to study physio, and then since university have become, again, back to being a lower level club runner, I would say, than I was then. And I've run sort of 5 marathons, a number of ultra relay events and everything in between. And then as a physio, sort of naturally developed into the sports world as I left the NHS, and it's a natural fit to then work with runners. And that sort of, I noticed that more and more with runners, I was seeing common things, but also there was this gap between sort of when a runner gets out of pain from an injury and where they want to get back to, which is whatever level of running they were doing before, basically.
So you've basically combined what was a hobby and a profession now, which is great. And I think when people see physiotherapists, I'm not much of a runner. I have run a marathon, but I think it's really important that if you are a really keen runner, that you are engaging with a physiotherapist that has almost been there and done it, because then they can really go through the process and the experience with you.
Yeah, I think it definitely helps. It helps to be, it makes it easier to be empathetical, to show empathy for sure. It helps that I understand the training process. It helps that I coach the training process. So for the last 5 years or so, I've coached runners from kids to adults, from track runs up to marathon and ultra events. So you can get in that hole with the patient and also sort of understand how stressed someone is if they've picked up an injury and they only have X number of weeks in the run up to their big day.
Cool. So let's focus on, the person that is signed up for a marathon, maybe their first one. And what is the most common mistake or a top tip that you would give somebody that's about to embark on that roughly 16-week journey?
Yeah, I think, I take one step back. I think if you've already signed up, and we'll talk about that. Yeah. But I think if you're thinking of signing up for that first marathon, the first thing is you need to be ultra realistic in terms of where you are. And what I mean by that is, what's your running age? How long have you been running for? What distances have you already covered? So if you're a brand new runner, you've just completed couch to 5K, I don't think it's that sensible to go straight to the marathon. I just think you're asking a lot of your body. It doesn't mean you can't, and it can definitely be done. But I think we know that your cardiovascular aerobic energy systems will adapt much quicker to running faster than, say, your bones, muscles, joints, and ligaments. So the faster you try and go to those longer distances, the more likely you are to pick up an injury or a problem. So I think be realistic in that respect, but also be realistic in, do you genuinely have the time to train for a marathon?
Massive commitment, isn't it?
It's a huge commitment. You need to find probably somewhere between 6 and 10 extra hours in your week to do it properly.
Yeah.
And if you don't think you've got those hours, you need to consider, and you can't rob them. You can't rob them from your sleep. You can't. You could rob them from your family, but that might have issues.
You could rob them from your work, but don't get caught.
From work, but don't get caught, or you might end up. So I think you need to both say, is it realistic for my body to do it just yet? Be patient. You can run into your 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. So, and also, is it realistic with my current lifestyle to be able to do it justice and train for it properly And it's doing those two things that are going to make you more likely to be able to complete that journey, basically.
So let's say somebody's thinking about signing up for a marathon and they're thinking, well, actually, I'm going to do it maybe next year.
Yeah.
Just without going into too much detail, what sort of things would be beneficial to the body to allow it to adapt to get ready for that first marathon?
Yeah, so like you said, most plans are around 16 weeks. Yeah. So if you're looking a year ahead, you've got time to prepare your body to be able to complete the 16-week program. So you need to look at, marathon programs are going to ask you to run anywhere between a minimum of 3 times a week, and I think that's a push to do a marathon on 3 runs a week, but probably more likely 4 to 6 runs a week. And for elites and people above, more than that, basically. So you need to start getting your body used to the frequency of exercise. Doesn't have to be long, but you need to build up to sort of doing some aerobic cardiovascular exercise, 3, then 4, then 5 times a week, of low intensity initially and of low volume, but just getting used to that, basically. You also have that perfect time where you're not trying to put in these really long runs to be starting to condition your body as well. So the classic thing that we love to talk about as physios, you can start to do your strength and conditioning. You can build that ability to attenuate and absorb forces. You can start to strengthen muscles, tendons, bones with various types of exercise. And you can prepare your body as best as possible.
And that doesn't necessarily have to be going to the gym all the time, does it?
No, definitely not to begin with. I think when you get a bit further down the line, we sort of know for distance runners, probably heavy lifting or plyometrics, and we could touch on those on other times.
And plyometrics, you want to just explain what that is?
So plyometrics is in its simplest form, well, I think jumping, but essentially it's asking your muscles and tendons to lengthen and then shorten at speed. Yeah. Essentially like they do
so like hopping, skipping,
jumping,
running, obviously.
Running. And if you've not done that for a while, say you ran as a kid, you did PE, but now you're 30, you haven't really done anything in your 20s, you will have lost that sort of plyometric ability, and retraining it before you embark on a lot of running could be a really nice way to reduce your risk of injury and also improve your running efficiency, or what we call economy, when you get a bit further down the line as well. So I think use that early time to get used to frequency, because then you can add volume. By volume, I mean distance. Yeah. And then also use that time to strengthen and get your muscles stronger, your tendons stronger, and improve your bounciness, plyometric ability.
I always, I used to do F45, and I used to do a squat, and I could cope with that. And then they got me to do a squat and then jump. Yeah. And it literally multiplied the forces going. It just felt so much harder. Yeah. And I think that's a good example, isn't it, where that plyometric, that springiness, just it really goes to. And if you do it at home, do 10 squats and then do 10 squats with a jump in between, and you will find how much harder it is and how much harder it feels on your joints. But that's what running is, isn't it?
Then multiply that by thousands. Yeah, it's simple maths, but if you want to do it, you're going to take on average 160 to 180 steps a minute when you run. So that's 80 to 90 per leg. If it takes you 5 hours to do a marathon, then you've got 300 minutes times by 90. I'm not going to quickly do it. No, it's a lot. Essentially, it's a lot of ground contact. It's a lot of what we call loading cycles. Yeah, and you obviously don't need to do that many jumps in preparation. No. But just doing some over an extended period of time and progressively challenging your body a bit more is going to mean that when you start your training program of whatever length it is, you're more likely to tolerate those running forces, essentially.
So what we're saying is ideally, we'd probably have a 3-month, if not longer, roll up where you're actually getting your body used to it, you're getting stronger, you're becoming more active. But let's say, which is what everybody does, they've signed up for a marathon.
Yeah, and that's the more likely scenario.
Exactly, and we'll embrace that. Yeah. So 16 weeks, let's be clear, that comes from no research or evidence really, does it? It's just a made-up number, but roughly 16 weeks, which means that generally if you're doing it in April, you're going to start just after Christmas, aren't you? Yeah. So what is the biggest error that you see that you think results in an injury with marathon training?
Yeah, so I think it gets a sort of saying that comes out is the rule of twos. 2 spelt T-O-O. So the common errors are too much, too often, too hard, too soon, essentially. Yeah. And what that means is, like you said, often for the spring marathons, you've just had a Christmas period. You've probably not done a great deal in that time.
Quite a lot of...
Probably a few kilos heavier than you were, and a little bit less fit than you were even at the beginning of December.
Yeah, that's true.
And then your plan might have on it 5 runs in that first week with a long run of 12k, 16k or 10-ish miles, and a session where you're going to go out and run 6 hard 800 meters or something like that.
Like I feel injured even just by talking about it.
And it's just your body is going to go, at the very least, it's going to go, whoa, and you're going to ache like mad and you're going to be sore. Yeah. Or you're going to start laying down the foundations of an injury that's going to rear its head a few weeks down the line, like a lot of tendon and bone injuries do. Or even in that first week, your body's going to say, no, this is way more than I'm used to. You've done far too much too soon. So you need to be really looking at that first week of the plan and then what you've done in the prior 4 weeks and say, is it sensible for me to actually do that week? Because plans are not set in stone. A good plan is adaptable. So you might look at that first week and say, you know what, I'll do 50% of that plan this week because I have had a rubbish 4 weeks. Yeah. And then I'll ease myself into the plan over the first few weeks. Yes, you'll then panic that you're not getting all the sessions ticked off, but actually your body's much more likely to cope with that
and adapt.
And adapt. And the meat of the plan is the middle sort of 6-8 weeks. Right. So those first few weeks, if you don't get all those sessions done, it's really not going to be a disaster for you, especially in those early marathons.
And I think it's almost like the injuries we're talking about that are common, things like stress fractures, tendon problems, they're sort of like these silent injuries that come and you don't know it sometimes, isn't it? So you might actually get through the first 2 weeks and think, oh, I'm great. But actually that doesn't mean there isn't something brewing in the background. And that's what you're saying really, is that you've got to be realistic. You've got to have rest periods. You've got to have days off running if you're new to running, because that's where your body's going to start building those, you're going to get new bone, you're going to get the tendon turnover, and you're going to get stronger essentially, and therefore you'll be able to adapt to the load. So let's say that somebody's completely new.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, pretty completely new, not done a lot of running, maybe got up to 5K. How many, like with your guys, and I know it's different, but how many times a week should they be running?
Yeah, so that's where I think, again, like I said earlier, I think the minimum you'll see on plans is 3.
3, yeah.
And that gives you recovery days. Yeah. But what it means is that you're probably doing, and the classic thing that will look like is 2 short midweek runs and a long weekend run.
Yeah.
But that means your training plan looks like 5K, 7K, and then you're suddenly running 20K at the weekend. And again, that spike in training load is big. But that's not to say you can't get to a marathon of 3 hours a week. For that new runner, I would say what you need to remember is what you're trying to train at this point is energy systems. Yeah. You're trying to get your body used to using carbohydrate really well and then fat really well over longer periods of time. So you could be saying, if your plan, for example, has 5 runs on it, and you think, I just don't think I can cope with 5 runs. You could
get a new plan.
Yeah, I could get a new plan, or look at that run and say, where, for example, on a Tuesday, it says just 40 minutes easy running. That does not need to be running. Go and do that on a bike. Yeah. Go and do that on a cross trainer. Get the aerobic work. Still get that done.
Get out of breath, basically.
Yeah, still get those aerobic energy system changes that you're trying to get, but you don't get any of the impact. And it is the
So it could be swimming, could be cross trainer, could be bike.
Yeah.
But you want to get to a point where you're out of breath, you can't speak in sentences.
If that's what the session demands.
Exactly.
So if that session was low intensity, then you would want to keep it at conversational pace. Yeah. But see your heart rate sort of go up if you're using a watch or something these days into those low zones. But if the session was a 40-minute tempo run that's supposed to get you sort of out of breath, then that's what you need to try and mimic on the bike or the cross trainer. Yeah. So that would, I think, in those early stages for the brand new runner, the minimum, I think you've got to run at least 3 times a week. And ideally as the plan goes, you run a bit more. Yeah. But in those early stages, that still have at least 1 or 2 rest days. And then that gives you 2 days where you could do your gym work. That can be your strength, and it can be your low impact cross training. Basically. And
probably allow a day between any of those sessions for...
Yeah, definitely. I think you've got to have at least 1, probably 2 full proper rest days where you can be active. You can obviously move around. You might treat yourself to some of the nicer recovery things. But you really need to have those recovery days as well, especially if the most you've been used to running is sort of 3 5Ks in a week.
Yeah.
And now you're asking to run 30, 40K a week. You've got to really nail your recovery.
I know. And the other thing that this makes me think about when I was doing my marathon training is panic and fear.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's classic, isn't it, that on Monday, Tuesday, they're abroad or they're away with work or they just haven't been able to fit in their run. So they instead put it to a Wednesday and a Thursday.
Yeah.
And then they do a long run on Saturday and they really start cramming it in.
Yeah.
Because the fear is that they don't want to miss a session.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bit of a myth in itself, isn't it? I think missing a session, I would say, is fine. You can always do something similar, but like you said, do a cross-trainer session. But I think one thing to get across is that if you miss a session, you miss a session. You can't catch it up most of the time.
Yeah, and you often don't need to. I think if you complete over a 16-week plan, 80% plus of most people are not going to complete 100%.
No.
And if
that's really important for people to know because people panic when they start missing 1 or 2 runs.
Yeah,
but
it's just very unreal. Even at elite level, elites are going to get up some days and go, you know what, the training's taken its toll this week. I'm tired. They'll speak to their coach, and that might be the different thing. They'll have a voice of reason at the end of the phone, and the coach will say, take today off.
Yeah.
Or take
the good coaches will say that.
The good coaches will, and hopefully the good coaches are at that elite level.
Yeah.
But the rest of us, novice amateurs, will do exactly what we said. They'll look at their week and gone, it's Thursday and I haven't trained yet. I need to get 4 sessions in this week. Well, I'll train Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Yeah. And doing that regularly, I think you've just got to let those sessions go and say, as long as I get to the end of my plan, I've done 80, 90% of the sessions and I've sort of nailed the quality sessions, you're going to be fine.
And your distance is generally going up.
And your distance is going up and your sort of quality of session in terms of keeping your easy stuff easy and getting the most out of your hard stuff is there. I think that's really important. The other thing I'd add, just going back to as well, when you said about panic, when you look at your plans and you're like, I'm not used to running 40K a week. I think often it's useful to take the distance away and replace it with time and say, okay, well, actually, 40K running at 5-minute kilometers is going to be this many minutes. I need to try and do this many minutes of cardio this week. So half of that might be running. And then another quarter of it could be on the bike. And
honestly, if more people did what you just said there, we'd be going out of business. Because that advice on its own is such a nice way of, and that takes away some of the fear and panic as well, because they know they're doing it.
Yeah, you're doing it. You're ticking off those minutes. And obviously the long runs, the running sessions are super important. But most people, a classic example is most people have the recovery run. Yeah. Now, I'm not sure how the term recovery and run go hand in hand at all. And people will do their towards the end of their plan, they'll have an 18-miler on a Sunday. They'll run their legs off. They'll be exhausted. They'll try and eat and fuel, hopefully, that evening.
And then Tuesday,
probably Monday morning. Probably Monday morning is recovery run on their plan, and their legs are exhausted. Their neuromuscular systems are exhausted. Yeah. They've got no spring in their legs and they're trying. Why not go and do that in a pool? Yeah. Why not go and do that on a bike? Yeah. Why not push it to Tuesday if you're really achy?
I totally agree.
Sort of plans are too rigid. You need to see all running plans as being really flexible and adaptable. Yeah. And they're not a sort of, if you've not ticked it all off, you're going to fail. Yeah.
But the principles of the first few weeks, the next few weeks are probably quite similar, aren't they? And what you're saying essentially is don't panic in that first 6 weeks. For God's sake, don't go over top with it, but just build some foundations where you've got some time on your feet. So through running, but also just really build that cardiovascular tolerance, fitness, and tolerance for your joints and tendons. And
especially if you've not done that preparatory phase before that, you've sort of had a few months where you've really not done much. You have to use those first 4 to 6 weeks as that's your preparatory phase. Yeah. That's going to prepare you for probably the middle 8 weeks, and then you're going to have your little taper sharpening period at the end, basically.
Absolutely.
And that's how I would break it up for runners, basically.
And it's quite simple, but it should be quite simple. I think some of the plans can be quite complicated. Do you want to there's always this thing, isn't there, about how many fast runs and shorter runs should you do, longer runs? You know, what's your opinion around that, particularly for these more novice sort of marathon runners? Yeah. Should they be sprinting? Should they be doing sort of more tempo runs or long runs? Or what's your thoughts around that?
So I think you absolutely need to be doing some fast running. Yeah. Right. But again, it's all about what your body's prepared for. But On a basic level,
So faster than the marathon pace.
faster than your marathon pace. You're looking to, at a simple level, depending on how many runs you've got in the week, there are different training approaches, but the two most common are something called a polarized approach and a pyramidal approach. And a polarized approach means you're essentially running in two zones of difficulty. You've got really easy running, low intensity that keeps your heart rate low, and that's going to make up at least sort of 80% of your training because it's all about building your aerobic base. But then you've got 20% that is about trying to change other systems, particularly things like your lactate threshold, which is a complicated thing to talk about.
So can you simply, or try and simply, because people will see this term lactate threshold.
Yeah.
What do we mean simply put?
So you'll see it called lactate threshold or ventilatory threshold. And it's not the same as things like VO2 max, which is another term that people get, especially off their watches these days. Essentially, there are two, when you're running, to create the energy you need to run, you have a byproduct, which very briefly is lactic acid, but we don't build up lactic acid in our body. As soon as that's made, it's split and something called lactate is made. And that's actually a useful chemical. It can go back into the energy system and we can use it as fuel. But we have to become efficient at doing that. Now, we'll only start producing that chemical at a certain threshold of intensity, think of it that way, or heart rate intensity, essentially. And that's called our ventilatory threshold or lactate threshold 1, basically. And at that point, our body can deal with that lactate well, and we can keep going at that speed. That's often in and around the pace you're going to run your marathon at, basically. So it's a speed at which your body starts to physiologically change. It's generating this chemical.
Which you have to go into because that is going to happen during the marathon.
That will happen in the marathon. You need that. You need lactate. It's a good thing. People see it as this really bad thing, but actually it's a good thing. It goes back into the energy system, basically. As your speed and intensity goes up, you'll reach what's called the second lactate threshold, which is where lactate exponentially starts to rise in the bloodstream. And that's happening because your body can no longer reuse it as quickly as you're producing.
So it is at that point building up.
It's building up.
For one.
And that's often when people start to get that burn in their legs. But again, that's not necessarily because of the lactate, but they happen at the same time, basically. And that's not a sustainable speed. That might be a speed you can run at for, say, 40 minutes to an hour, but it's certainly not a speed you can run at for a marathon. But if you train fast, going back to what we're talking about, if you do certain types of sessions, and you'll hear different terms, tempo and threshold and things like that, but essentially you're running at probably up and above 85% of your heart rate, is probably a simple way of thinking of it, you will start to train that system and your body becomes more efficient at what we call buffering, using that lactate, and those thresholds can start to move. And again, if you spend more time doing long, slow, easy runs, you can move that lower threshold up, and that means the pace you can sustain for a longer period of time start, and that's how we become faster runners. So you need fast running because you need to challenge that system and you need to get your body better at dealing with lactate.
So what would be you said 85% of heart rate. How long would a threshold session normally be?
So thresholds are normally interval style sessions. So that a classic marathon session might be 5 times a mile, something like that. And so you'd be doing your mile in a pace that you feel you could run, like in your 10K pace. If you've done a 10K and you know what your 10K time is, then you'd be running your miles at your 10K time, something like that. And that it's not lab tested.
And then the other next mile will just be
then you take
low
a
intensity,
bit of recovery. It might be,
but you're still running, aren't you?
So you could do a very short walk recovery, or you could do a longer, slower run recovery. Then you take your heart rate back up again, and you sustain it there for a number of minutes.
So up, down.
Then you bring it back down and let it recover. Then you take it back up again, and it will be a rough approximation of where your lactate threshold is. The only way you can truly know that is with lab testing. But for most people, it will sit in and around that sort of 85, 87% heart rate, or in and around the time a run you could sustain for 40 to 60 minutes, essentially, which for a lot of people is around their 10K mark, basically.
Okay, and you would do that for how long?
And you might do, in a session, you might try and do 20, 30 minutes worth of running at that threshold. So it could be in mile intervals, it could be a sustained
But
run.
again, you would build up to that, wouldn't you? But you can start these quite early. Just you might only end up doing 5 minutes of.
So in your early plan, your plan might have 4 lots of 5 minutes at threshold, which is just it's a sustained effort essentially, with a recovery in between, and it all comes down to what you're used to doing. If you're not used to doing anything other than steady state running, then you need to drip feed it in, and you might initially do 4 times 2 minutes, just running a bit harder, just getting used to that, and then with a little recovery. So it's very individual, but the principle is you need to have a bulk of your running slow and a small amount high intensity.
And that's probably going to be once a week?
If you're only running 3 times a week, it's probably once a week. If you're 5 times a week, you probably do 2 sessions a week, and your 5 runs a week will naturally lend itself to sort of 2 easy runs, 2 sessions, and a long run.
Yeah.
It's quite, and then if you're doing 3 runs a week, it naturally lends itself to an easy run, an interval or threshold run, and a long run, basically. And then ideally some other cardio like we talked about on the bike.
In between,
like that,
so
basically.
some time off feet, but where you're still training your heart and lungs.
Exactly.
So one of the areas that I see quite a lot is the emphasis on the long run. Normally it's a Saturday or Sunday, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I've definitely had patients over the years where, you know, they might do a little bit of running in the week, but they just focus on that long run because it starts at, say, 10, it goes to 14. It gives you that objective or that confidence that you are actually running longer. Have you got any thoughts around how important that long run is and the emphasis that's put on it?
Yeah, I've got lots of thoughts on the long run.
Yeah,
but
I thought so.
I think the simple ones would be, it is the most important run for the marathon. Absolutely. It's the most important run. But it doesn't mean you can just sort of do nothing all week and then just do your long run and do nothing all week. And then your body can't sustain that, basically. It's just too much of a shock. But it is important. It does need to go up to a reasonably long distance. That's a question that people often ask, how long should my long run be?
So if the marathon's 26.2, is it?
26 miles. Very rarely, certainly at novice amateur level, will you cover the distance in training. Elites do, they often do cover the distance in training, but in a broken up style run.
I think I went up to 21 miles.
Yeah, and it's interesting. When I coach people, I don't take them up to any mileage. I take them up to 3 hours.
Okay.
Which can scare people, because if you're thinking your marathon time is going to be 5 hours and your long run is only 3 hours, people off that is a lot of no man's land that you've not experienced. But the reason I limit it to 3 hours is you reach a point of diminishing returns. So at 3 hours, you have significantly fatigued your musculoskeletal system. You have really challenged your oxidative energy system. So your ability to use carbohydrates and fat as fuel, you've challenged it. You're starting to fatigue. You're starting to lose your bounce, your sort of plyometric ability. So beyond 3 hours, you're not going to add a great deal to your fitness, but you are going to add time to your recovery, and you are going to add trauma to your body. So I'm not sure there's a lot to be gained.
And I'm sure lots of people are quite pleased to hear that, because, you know, people do get very worried if they haven't actually been able to do the full mileage. But you're saying that, as you say, diminishing returns, really. Yeah.
So it's not to say you can't. And I'll have people say, I want to. I think the range is normally 18 to 22 miles. People that do measure it, that's the range. Some people that are really worried about how that last bit's going to go will want to go to 22 miles. Some people will be happy to say they've ticked off 18 and they know what it feels like. The way I sometimes get people to get around it, if they're worried that they needed to have gone longer, is I would say, look, if your long run's Sunday morning, go and do an hour Saturday night. Go and do an hour.
So it's a cumulative, if you like.
So you've still, and go and do that hour, not hard, but push yourself a little bit.
Get quicker than marathon pace.
Get a bit of fatigue in your legs. Then go and eat and sleep. And then you'll still have that fatigue in your legs on Sunday morning for your long run. And it will help you mimic that fatigue towards the end of the marathon. But you haven't needed to run for 4 hours. Basically.
That's nice as well, because often people, you know, the long run takes a long time, doesn't it? And some people struggle with like how long they're going to go, and maybe they can split that long run up and still get the gains, which is what you're saying. And
I've had people do 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening. Same day, you get your 4 hours in.
And I think that's what you're saying, is that flexibility, isn't it? But it's very hard for people that essentially they're following a training plan with absolutely or very little knowledge of what they need to do. And I think that's where working with somebody like yourself, a coach or a physio that has done it and actually work through it. But you know, I'm a physio myself, but you know, you have so much more experience with what we're talking about. I think it's important that people are getting the information off people that have been there, done it, but also, you know, not every physio has that knowledge. It's got to be something that you're interested in, that you've done further development in and that sort of thing.
And that would be, not everyone come and see me, definitely.
No.
I can't see it. But that would be in my top tips, is that if you're completely new, go and get some help. Go and speak to someone. There is so much out there now. It used to be that the athletics club was the only place you could go to find a running coach. And because of that, people didn't want to go there because you'd go there and it would be seasoned runners, and it can be quite a cliquey, daunting place to go. But now there are online coaches, there are social running groups, there are you'll be able to find a group that have got people in there that can give you some decent advice. They're maybe not coaches, but they can give you tips from their mistakes that they've learned. There's a lot more stuff to read online. There's podcasts, there's vlogs. So you can go and you should be trying to become a bit of an expert in your sport. I think all sports people should be a bit of an expert in their sport. So I think going and getting that bit of information from somewhere, and if it means initially going and speaking to a coach or a physio coach or something, I think it's well worth doing.
Yeah. It's a lot to go through on your own.
It is, and you're going to invest so much time and money on equipment and your event and all the other things you might do around fundraising and things like that. I think it's well worth investing a little bit of money and time in a bit of advice and coaching.
Yeah, absolutely.
In those areas, because like you said, the plans on the whole are generic. Yeah. Which means for a group of people, they will be fine. Yeah. But there'll be outliers at both ends of those plans that they just don't suit. Yeah. And that's sort of, if you can't recognize that quite early, then you're going to maybe try and follow something that's just, you could be doing much better. Doesn't mean you're going to get injured, but it could mean you could just be doing things much better.
Absolutely. What's your thoughts, and this will definitely link into a few errors that we see, particularly for those new sort of marathon runners. What's your thought around people deciding on they want to do a sub 4, they want to do a sub 5, would you encourage that, or would you see how their training goes? What's your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think if you have an idea of how fast you are over other distances, then I think setting goals makes a lot of sense. Agreed. So if you've done, particularly the nearer the distance, the better. So if you've done a half marathon, and you know you've done a half marathon in 1:40, 1:45, then I think setting sub 4 as a goal is realistic. Yeah. If you've got nothing to go off other than maybe your local park run, and you're using that to say, okay, I think I did park run in 25 minutes, so I think I can do a marathon in 3:30. That's exactly the same pacing, by the way. Yeah. I don't think that's very sensible. Yeah. And so I think setting those goals can come, but it should come later. When you're doing like 14, 16, 18 mile runs, and you're starting to see sort of how you're coping with those longer runs. Which won't necessarily, your long runs shouldn't all be at marathon pace. They should normally be slower than marathon pace, maybe with some marathon pace miles in them.
But as you go through the program, you'd start.
Yeah, as you get further in, you put your marathon pace in. But only then, or you could halfway through, 2/3 of the way through your plan, have a warm-up event, have a half marathon event, and then use that to set your goals. But goals are interesting. I always say to first marathoners, just enjoy the process. Yeah. Process of training for it is so life-changing, committing to it and doing it properly. And on the day, whatever marathon you've entered, but if you're in a big one with lots of support and lots of people, soak it up, enjoy it. And the absolute first goal should be to cross the line with a smile on your face. Yeah. It sounds a bit corny, but such an achievement.
You can always do another one.
You can always do another one, but you can have A, B, and C goals. I'll always have patients have A, B, and C goals. If everything goes absolutely perfect, swimmingly well, this is what we're going for. But if on the day you've trained in 14 degrees, on the day it's 22 degrees, you need to have another goal.
Yeah. Or you've had to have a couple of weeks out because of an injury.
You've been ill, you've been injured, you need to have another goal. Yeah. And you also, if you have goals on the day, like my first marathon, absolute disaster. My second marathon had 3 goals. The first one was to beat my first marathon. The second one was to run a certain time, and the third one was to run a certain time. Yeah. What that meant is that I hit my B goal. I didn't hit my A goal. The other way around to what I said to them. But what that meant was when my first goal was gone, I didn't fall apart mentally. Because I just refocused on, okay, that's gone, but I'm still well inside my B goal.
I think that's really good advice.
So I'll keep going. And then I comfortably got my B goal and then went back for my A goal in the next marathon, basically. So,
do you have any top tips around recovery during the training program? So we've already alluded to sort of making sure that you have some days off. That's really important. Yeah. Any other sort of tips?
Yeah, I think recovery is, it's very vogue at the moment. I think there's a lot more people talking about it, which is good. It's half your training if you look at it that way. It doesn't matter how good your training program is, if you're not getting your recovery right, because it's not just the days off is a big part of it, a massive part of it. But then after that, it's not what people used to see it as. It's not ice baths. No. It's certainly not balms you rub up and down your leg. Yeah. It is sleep, and it's getting a minimum of Really, it's 7 to 9 hours for an adult, but
Yeah.
I would say it's minimum 8. Elites tend to get 8 or 9, and then a 2-hour nap. So if you look
Lazy.
at them, they're very lazy. They're getting paid to do it, so we can't do that. But we can get 8. I think it goes back to the very first question. When you commit to the marathon, you need to realistically say, can I do the recovery as well as the training? Because if you're working till midnight and then trying to get up at 5 a.m. and do your run,
it's not going to work, is it?
And your risk of injury is nearly double. As soon as you go below 7 hours sleep a night, your risk of injury almost doubles. So especially over a sustained period. So sleep's one. Nutrition, which is obviously not my expert area, but really simply, you have to be fueling your training.
Got to eat.
You've got to eat. Marathon training and weight loss don't go hand in hand. If you're trying to lose weight while marathon training, you're under fueling. And your risk of injury. And a lot of people do try and tie them together.
Yeah, they do, yeah.
And you might almost accidentally lose a little bit of weight, but if you're trying to drop loads of pounds and train, you have to be in a calorie deficit. And if you're in a calorie deficit, you're under fueling for the training. Yeah. So you've got to be fueling. You've got to be fueling your long runs. You've got to start getting used to fueling on your long runs. But as a recovery tool, you need to make sure you're getting that calorie intake that matches your basic day-to-day needs plus your training. And you need to be getting good food in, plenty of protein. And then they're your 2 main pillars of recovery. Yeah. If you're doing that, and ideally you want to manage your stress loads, but we can't do everything. You can't always do that. You haven't always got the control over that. But in an ideal scenario, if there are elements of stress in your life you can remove them basically. After that, you can do the sexy stuff. Yeah. Then you can go and get yourself a £500 massage gun. Yeah. And you can sort of start using the various supplements and balms and things like that. But that doesn't replace the sleep. No. Exactly. See, that's the pillars, and then underneath, on top of that, you put the other thing. Absolutely, go and get some soft tissue therapy. I think it's really useful. You're pushing your body. You're asking your body to do things it hasn't done before. Yeah. But again, even that doesn't replace the bits underneath. No. So if you're doing the basics, treat yourself to the stuff above. Yeah. But the stuff above is like classic. There was a really good bit of evidence that looked at stress fractures, which is obviously a big risk for running. And they looked at all the variables, and the key variable that they put it down to was those that didn't have over, I think it was 7 hours sleep, were more likely to. That was the only sort of independent variable that they could put it down to. They ended up with stress fractures. It's so true, isn't it? It's not surprising at all. It's where your body, human growth hormones released in that deep sleep, and that's when you can do your repair work. So if you're not getting it, and it's quality sleep as well. If you're drinking 3, 4, 5 nights a week, which a lot of the city folk we see are as part of their job role, that's not good quality sleep. So you might say, oh, I'm in bed for 9 hours, but... So it's not a good time to lose weight, but it's definitely a good time to try and cut down the alcohol and the cigarettes. It's definitely a good time to cut down those things. Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. It's just going to help you recover. Absolutely. I think alcohol's a big one. People often say to me, when shall I stop drinking? I love that question. Now. Why haven't you already? But they'll normally say, okay, well, I'll drink up to 4 weeks before. And you sort of, you have to go with what they're going to do realistically. But I will always encourage, so if you can start cutting it down and out now. I remember when I was doing it, you naturally end up doing that anyway, because you're quite busy. You're probably socializing a bit less because you're trying to fit everything in. Yeah. And then you almost don't feel like doing it because the next day you've got a long run or a short run. To interfere, absolutely. So one of the things that we often, and we were actually talking about this related to shin splints earlier, or what we call MTSS, or medial tibial stress syndrome. So one thing that is really difficult is for patients to get the right trainers, and there's so much information out there. Yeah. Have you got any advice for people that are trying to choose a trainer? Any simple advice? I think simple advice. So I think what's made it more complicated these days is that we've now got performance shoes. So prior to that, I would have said, just go for comfort. And comfort is king is often a phrase, but it is a marathon shoe needs to be lightweight and comfortable. It has to be that, because more grams of weight on your feet make it harder per step. And obviously you don't want to run for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours in something that isn't comfortable. So comfort is still king in my opinion. Yeah, totally agree. There is now this sort of, do you want to get a bit of assistance from your footwear? Do you want to spend a little bit more? And these shoes definitely do that. So you're talking specifically about the carbon plate shoes. There's loads of them out there now. The price varies on them. Obviously, it's now become a market of who's got the best performance enhancer rather than just who's got one, because so many companies are making them now. You can even buy carbon plated trail shoes.
So that's a shoe that almost gives you that propulsion as you're running.
Exactly that. My understanding is that it sort of attenuates a bit of that force and acts a bit like a spring.
Yeah.
And gives you a little
Sounds
bit of that
perfect.
It does. And I have a pair.
Yeah.
They make a huge difference. I now have like PBs and PBs with a star, because the ones that I've run in the shoes that I feel are, I'm not sure how I feel about them still, basically. But yeah, so the things I would say is
performance enhanced. I mean, they are performance enhancing.
Performance enhancing shoes, but I think because they're available to everyone, they're not deemed as cheating.
And you are allowed to wear them in America.
But so going back to your question, I think a couple of things. If you can, I would have more than one pair on rotation.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of not brilliant quality evidence that suggests that if you vary your footwear, it just varies where the stresses go. You can't eliminate the forces of running, but you can move them around a little bit. And so simple advice we know is that if you have a shoe that's got, so something we probably need to just quickly discuss is something called the heel to toe drop, which is the difference in height between the back of the shoe and the front of the shoe. So you've got foam on the bottom of the shoe, and let's say at the back it's 25 millimeters and at the front it's 15 millimeters. That shoe has a 10 millimeter drop. And all shoes will sit somewhere between 0 and 12. You occasionally see 14, but and you can find it online. You just put in the name of the shoe you want and just put the word drop on Google, and you'll find it. It's easy. So the higher,
and that will change the way that you run.
That will change the way the forces go through your legs when you run. Is the easy way of thinking of it, and it will potentially slightly change your biomechanics of how you run a little bit. And in terms of those forces, what we know is that if you've got a higher drop, so say you've got a 10, 12 millimeter drop, you will offload the calf complex a little bit. So you won't work the calf quite so hard, but you will move that force a little bit more to your knee and hip. So if you've got a history of calf and Achilles issues, that might be a sensible shoe for you. And then the other way around, if you've got a flat shoe, maybe a 4 mil drop, that will put more stress through the foot, the bones of the foot and the arch of the foot, and then the calf and the Achilles. But it will put less stress through the knee and the hip. So if you've got a history of knee and hip issues, you may benefit a little bit more from a shoe that's a bit more of a low drop. That's something definitely to consider.
And as a general rule, you can disagree with this, but as a general rule, if you're a novice marathon runner, you're probably going to go for a for a 10 to 12 mil heel.
There's more of those available, and they're generally the more cushioned, supportive shoes. So that's normally where you go. And one thing just to bear in mind is that when you go and buy your new shoes, check what your current shoes are, and that you're not, without realizing,
changing it massively.
A massive drop.
So the example you gave earlier is you had a lady that had a 10 mil drop, said she fancied buying a new pair of shoes, saw the ones that looked pretty cool, and it turned out she actually had a 5 mil drop, and she ended up having an injury, and she didn't know anything about that.
No, and it was the only thing we really dug into her history. The only thing that had changed in the last 3 months for her was the shoes changed 4 weeks ago, and her symptoms came on about a week ago. And we know with bone stress injuries, there's often a 3 to 4 week delay. So that is what we're sort of blaming. Causation's impossible, but that's looking like the biggest culprit here for her, basically. And it's just an easy mistake to make, because it is not. You go in a shoe shop, you'll have neutral shoes and stability shoes, and that's about the only information that's easily available. Everything else you have to kind of do your own research, or a good shoe salesperson will be able to talk you through it. But more and more we're buying online, so you sort of need to read about your shoes.
So I just want to pick up on two things that you said. The first thing we're going to pick up on is the idea of, at some point you're going to have to decide, and you'll probably decide quite early, what shoe is your race shoe. Now, we know that shoes get worn out, and they get worn out when you run. During your training, you will be wearing your shoe at the most worn out stage of that shoe. Are you a fan, and I certainly recommend it, where if you've got a shoe you like, that you buy a second shoe?
Pair. Yeah, definitely. I think have that pair and sort of wear it in from maybe 3-4 weeks out. So it's sort of 100k in by the time you're on. So it's as fresh in terms of the foam and everything like that. It's as fresh as it was it came out.
So it's exactly the same shoe. But you're just going to start using that newer shoe 1 month before, because the problem is, if you don't have a second shoe, you are then using your first shoe after, I mean, how many miles would it have done?
Depending on the brand, you might have done between 5 and 800k. Now, if you've rotated 2 shoes, they've probably both done about 400k, maybe 3 to 4. So they might.
And you could wear your older one. It's just that you haven't used it. Most people would wear the newer one though, wouldn't they?
Yeah, and the foam does start to deteriorate in some of like the shoes that have the carbon plates, especially when they've got the carbon almost fingers. Like Adidas do this one with carbon. They've been shown to sort of crack and break. So if you were trying to get that boost, you might have lost that after a few 100 kilometers as well. So I think freshening the shoes up, getting the all of the upper is back to normal. So you've got to support the upper being everything above the sole. It's sort of nice and sort of as it was out the box as well, a bit more supportive around the ankle. I think just makes sense as long as you've got the ability to do it. I think.
And if you run a lot in rain, that can have an effect.
Rain, off-road, trail. You do start to, and again, even simple things like the grip just starting to wear on the bottom, and then if it's raining on the day, and it's just nice to have a more closer to box fresh pair. Not straight out the box, because obviously you want to know you've worn them in and be a little bit comfortable. Although a lot of trainer companies claim they're run out the box these days. I think it's still nice to know you've run a pair in.
Exactly, and give you that confidence. And one of the last things I want to touch on, which you've alluded to there with the shoes, is variety. And I think this is one of the biggest issues I see with my patients is they sort of get in a habit of running to work or running the same sort of route. And quite often that will be on concrete. You know, we live in a concrete jungle. And you've talked about variety in shoes, but I'm assuming that would also refer to many other areas of training as well. Yeah,
definitely. I think there's two benefits. The injury prevention, hard to prove, but that benefit. So that, like the footwear, if you vary your terrain, so some on grass, some off-road, some on a track, some on a treadmill, that's all slightly different stresses. We know that when we run on softer ground, our body naturally stiffens up a little bit around our joints. To sort of help attenuate those forces, and when we run on harder ground, we naturally flex a little bit more all of our joints to absorb those forces a little bit better. So having variety means you're varying the forces, and we know that most running injuries are one of overuse, overload. So if you have the variety, it's better. So hopefully you're already going to be varying speed because of your different types of training. If you're then varying your footwear, you're varying your terrain.
When you say vary footwear, you're probably thinking at most 2 different shoes.
Just a couple of pairs, unless you're certainly at a novice level. A higher level runner who's doing sort of 5, 6, 7 sessions a week might have 3 or 4 different pairs on the go for different reasons. But for most people, 2 shoes is going to be fine. Heel, and then there's the heels, which leads into the second bit. The second bit is to research your race. So if you're running London Marathon, pretty flat. If you're running going up to do Brighton, some pretty big hills at the beginning and towards the end of Brighton. I've done Liverpool Marathon. There's only 5 kilometers of flat in the entire marathon. Really? The rest of it is undulating.
That's really, so you've got to know this. Not every race is the same.
And you can find online, you can put your profile in, marathon course profile in, and you can find maps that will tell you total climb, total descent, all that stuff. So there's no point doing all your training on the flat and then getting to the marathon having to run 35 kilometers of hills, which is thankfully not what I did, but I didn't run enough hills. It was more than I was expecting. So, and again, the terrain is useful. We can use hills to our advantage. Again, running uphill, harder work on the calf, less stress on the knee. Running downhill, more stress on the knee. So if you are struggling with an injury or coming back, hopefully your physio is advising you, certainly on the treadmill, for example, classic injury, ITB. I'll get all my ITB runners when they first go back to running to use treadmill and use uphill work. Because it's less load on the knee. So you can use it both from an injury perspective, but also from a preparation perspective. Last bit on that would be on variety as well. And again, going to the event is also, there's no point always doing there's not no point. If you always do your long runs on, say, a Saturday afternoon and your marathon starts at 9 a.m. on a Sunday, you need to get your body used to getting up and running at that time of day. And if you can match conditions as best as possible, which is always hard in this country, but don't be afraid to go out and run in the rain. Don't be afraid to go out and run out when it's a bit warmer, but just take more fluids, run slower. But you need to have your body used to these different conditions as well as best as possible.
So variety really, as you've gone through there's so many different facets to how that variation. You've talked about treadmill running. I get a lot of conversation, or a lot of patients will say, well, can I just do this on a treadmill? Particularly when it rains, but you've already said get out there. But what is your thoughts? And I know there's a fair bit of research on this in terms of treadmill running for marathon training.
I think you definitely can. the sort of common arguments are the treadmill does some of the work. It sort of reduces the work of the push off because the treadmill's traveling backwards, which I don't think it does. We match the speed of the treadmill, so we don't get that quite as much as people think. But we do take slightly longer strides on treadmill. We do put a bit more force through our ankle and Achilles on a treadmill, so something to bear in mind again But I think there's nothing wrong with the treadmill. You can do it, but what the treadmill completely, if you do all your running on the treadmill, what you do definitely lose is that variety. You'll be very metronomic. You'll set your speed and you'll run at the same cadence, which is the number of steps per minute, the same step length. Nothing will change. You're running on a very narrow platform. We naturally sway as we run a little bit and run from side to side. So I think you will then find it harder physically and really interestingly,
because it's not the same, is it?
It's not the same.
It is easier on a treadmill.
It definitely, well, interesting. It feels easier to run slower on it. When you look at psychological studies, running, so marathon pace training on a treadmill feels easier, definitely.
Yeah.
Running hard on a treadmill feels harder than running at the same speed outside.
Because you've got to concentrate on staying on the track.
Concentrate, you sort of can see the thing ticking down. There's but from a psychological rating of exertion perspective, people rate treadmill running at slow pace is easier and running at fast pace is harder. But that means, again, if you feel like you're really getting used to running your marathon pace and then you go and take it outside and you think, wow, this is harder. Mentally, that's so much of the marathon is mental. You don't want to have a shock on the day that you think, actually, this is way harder than I was expecting to be because all I've done is prepare indoors. You also get no conditions. You get an aircon room, probably, unless you're at home. You get no wind. So you're not preparing yourself for any of that stuff. So a chunk of training on the treadmill, fine. But long runs,
20%. Can I get you to commit?
I think if you're doing 3 runs a week, maximum of one of those runs. I would say, and then so every 5 runs a week, probably still maximum one of those runs. So 20%.
And the key thing is there is very little variety. You can change the speed, but the impact's going to be very similar. So you're going to be loading the same part of the foot all the time. And we know that one of the biggest risk factors of injury, overuse, is going to be doing the same thing all the time. So again, it's that variety. Okay, well, I think we've covered an awful lot. Thank you very much, Alex. I'm sure you probably could do about another 10 podcasts, which I'm sure we will do. And if anybody's got any sort of questions, I know Alex is happy to take questions, but hopefully you found this useful. If you did, pop a little comment below. And I'm sure we'll be doing more podcasts and getting more information across to you to help you with your training. So thanks very much, Alex.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. Cheers.